So Solomon in the past Ecclesiastes says there was nothing new under the sun, but also heard that something old can become new again. So we're putting both of those to test today in our colloquy. This year, we're focusing on what we focus on every year in terms of law and religion, and taking it to a new level in interactive, interesting, dynamic discussions. So today we are especially and doubly grateful that we have two scholars with us to discuss recently discovered work on John Locke. So John Locke, as you know, has been gone for a while, but his writings have endured. And in fact, you can say, I don't think it's boasting to say, he's a forefather of our nation, as our founders have looked to his philosophy in building our democracy. But yet, there's a new discovery. And it's important for us, because these new discoveries in the field of law and religion, particularly religious freedom. So we have two scholars who will discuss that with us today, particularly new writings on, as you can see, reasons for tolerating papists equally with others, giving a new twist to an old understanding of Locke's view on religious freedom and Catholics in particular. So today we have Craig Walmsley and Dr. Felix Waldmann, both in England. So they've been kind enough to zoom in for us all the way from the UK. And we're doubly grateful to them because it is their evening. So before we get started, we are recording this. So if you're not comfortable being recorded, you may want to the princes of the recording, so you're not participating. And also, I invite you, after the discussion, I'm happy to provide it to you, but I invite you to also take a look at our newly launched Canopy Forum, canopyforum.org, which has an article provided by our scholars today. So without further ado, enough talking from me, let's hear from them. I'll turn it over to our scholars today.
Hello, my name's Craig Walmsley. I think you can see my slides, but I hope you can't see my picture because I'm sort of leaning in very close to the computer to hear what you're saying. If it's okay with you, maybe we'll do some quick intros, myself and Felix, just to say who we are a little bit, and then we'll walk you through a little bit about the discovery, kind of how it came about, what we think it means in the context of a particular time, and then what it means in the context of Locke's development of Locke's thought. So I hope that's okay. My name is, Craig Walmsley. I am also a doctor. I've studied the history of philosophy. I got my PhD in 1998, and I didn't take up an academic career, but I have continued to work on the life and work of John Locke, starting with his sort of epistemology, his views on natural philosophy, and I'm now one of the editors of the Clarendon edition of the works of John Locke at the Oxford University Press. The volume that I'm working on is all of Locke's philosophical works after the publication of the essay. So that will include the work on Malebranche and the conduct of the understanding and a few other bits and bobs. So that's me, Felix.
Hi, thanks, Craig. I'm Felix Waldmann. As you can tell, I also just recovering from a slight cold, so my speech is somewhat halting. I'm a fellow of Christ College in Cambridge, where I teach in the history faculty. I'm also, although my PhD was not about Locke, it's also to some extent about the history of philosophy in early modern Europe. And I'm editing a volume for the Clarendon edition of the works of John Locke, which is Locke's two treatises of government. Yeah, that's about it in terms of very brief introduction from myself. Did you want to, perhaps we'll hand it back to you, Craig. Pardon me. You can.
That's all right. Yeah.
Introduce the item. Yeah.
I will drive, as they say in the business. I'm not going to talk too much about John Locke. I think we had a very sort of erudite, brief, and to the point introduction by order there, but obviously he's an exceptionally influential fellow in the world of the history of philosophy. His three major works all came out in 1689, and they had a huge impact on the founding of the United States in a couple of different dimensions. As I'm sure you know, the two treaties of government were virtually paraphrased by Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence. Some of the wording is almost, you can imagine that Jefferson had the two treaties in front of him when he was writing that. And the separation of church and state, so put in the First Amendment to the Constitution by Madison, directly derives from Locke's thinking in a letter concerning toleration, which was also published in 1689. We are going to sort of talk a bit about toleration today, and I apologize for the tiny, tiny font on this particular slide, but we thought it'd be helpful just to sort of give you I'm going to just give you a very quick overview of the sort of timeline of Locke's work on toleration, because it will become reasonably salient as we are sort of working through the importance of the reasons for tolerating Papists equally with others. So Locke was born in 1632. He went to Oxford. He was he took up a studentship at Christ Church and was studying a variety of different bits and pieces of stuff at that particular point in time. I can't remember when he was made a Centre of Moral Philosophy. I think it was like 1660, but he'd been studying for a while, primarily medicine, but he also dabbled in other sort of religious and political topics. And he was studying toleration even at this early stage. So there's a letter to a man called Henry Stubb, who wrote the essay in defense of the good old cause in 1659, where Locke basically writes a sort of very adulatory letter to Stubb and says, oh, this is a great book, which at the time was reasonably pro-toleration. But then Locke spends quite a bit of time sort of, lamenting the fact that the toleration might be extended to Catholics. So even at this very early stage, he might have been leaning towards toleration, but he seems to be anti-Catholic in his sentiments. Charles II came back to the throne in 1660, and Locke was then writing some of his first political essays, which are known as the Two Tracts on Government. And here, these are somewhat sort of more conservative works, where Locke is sort of asserting that the magistrate, i.e. the ruler, should be able to tell people how they should carry out their religious worship, which is a reasonably conservative position, especially in comparison to what we know about Locke's work later on and what he's famous for. At around the same time, he's also writing the Discourse on Infallibility against papal claims that they could ex cathedra state certain things with absolute certainty. So there was always this sort of undertone of anti-Catholicism in his writing from this early stage of his career. At around the same time, the Act of Uniformity reimposed Anglicanism. There'd been a bit of the church and state had been a bit of a mess during the time of the Civil War, but uniformity of worship was now imposed on everybody, which was somewhat consistent with Locke's earlier position. But then in 1665, Locke he sort of went on a diplomatic mission to Cleves, and there's a letter where he writes home, a couple of different letters actually, where he's very surprised about how effective that society appears to be, because it was very tolerant. Everybody was allowed to sort of worship how they pleased, even the Catholics, and he sort of called out how unusual and strange it was, and how he found this rather surprising, that it seemed to actually work reasonably well in practice. So that was quite a bit of a turn of events for him. And then 1667 was a huge year in Locke's life. He met Anthony Ashley Cooper, Lord Ashley, who would later become the first Earl of Shaftesbury, and was invited by Ashley at the time to go to become part of Ashley's retinue or his household in London. So he moved from Oxford. He gave up sort of his, didn't give up his studentship, but he sort of moved away from that sedentary lifestyle and moved to the hurly-burly of London and politics, high politics, and became sort of very intimately linked with all the stuff that Shaftesbury was up to. And Shaftesbury was up to all sorts of interesting stuff. And we'll talk a bit more about the sort of pamphlet debate and all that kind of stuff. But this is when he writes his first sort of arguments for toleration. It was called the Essay Concerning Toleration. He wrote a first draft of it and then the essay proper. This is where he sort of first formulated his arguments for religious toleration in a systematic fashion. And there's been lots of questions around why he did that, what was going on at the time. We'll talk a bit more about the pamphlet debate a little bit later. But the sort of basic outline of this was that Charles II had become king. There was a massive naval defeat where the Dutch army sailed up the Thames to Medway, stole the flagship of the British fleet, called the Prince Charles, I think, burnt a bunch of other ships, and then tootled off with all their prizes. And this caused all sorts of ructions in the political scene, causing Charles II to consider creating some sort of religious tolerance to basically shore up his political support. And then there was a flurry of publications called the pamphlet debate, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. And there's been some questions as to whether or not, what sort of connection there was between Locke's writing this essay concerning toleration and all these political events in the background. And that question has been largely unresolved until now. But he was definitely interested in this, and he was writing arguments for toleration at this point. Moving to Shaftesbury's household seems to have changed his views in a number of different dimensions, not just in toleration, but he became a much more tolerant writer and thinker at this point, but always pointedly anti-Catholic, and we'll talk a bit more about that in the essay later on. He continued to be interested in this subject and wrote notes on a variety of other writers, Samuel Parker's Discourse of Ecclesiastical Polity, and then later against Edward Stillingfleet. There was all sorts of jiggery-pokery when the Duke of York, who was James's brother and potential heir to the throne, became Catholic. This led to the exclusion crisis, where people were thinking about writing legislation that would exclude Catholics from taking up the throne. There was then the Rye House plot, which was a potential plot to assassinate the king, which Ashley may have had some sort of hand in. Ashley is locked up and then flees the country. And Locke has to do the same a little bit later on because he was seen as Ashley's man. And it went into hiding in Holland. And it was at this point in about 1685, 1686 that he wrote the letter concerning toleration. So he actually wrote it whilst he was hiding from a Catholic king, strangely enough. There was the Glorious Revolution in 1688. He comes back to England. Well, actually, he published the, I think the letter, the Epistola de Tolerantia was published in Holland first, and then he comes back to England, and it's published in translation in England, and then he gets involved in a bit of a debate for all this sort of stuff, over time, and then sadly dies in 1704. So 1689 was when the classical statement of his toleration was made, but his arguments were first formulated all the way back in 1667. So yeah, that's the kind of toleration timeline that we want to be thinking about when we're looking at the development of his thought. And with that sort of context and background, we'll now come to this sort of discovery that we've made. So how did we go about to find a somewhat unknown Locke manuscript? And when I say unknown, I mean a Locke manuscript that, as far as I'm aware, no scholar or historian had ever read or seen up until I kind of came across it a couple of years ago. Well, the reason is kind of primarily down to Felix, if Felix doesn't mind me saying so. Actually, Felix, do you want to tell a story about how you kind of got into all this thing, and I'll kind of pick up with how I kind of rode on your coattail somewhat.
Sure. Thanks, Craig. No, it was great. And so Locke, not unlike a number of other quite eminent figures from the early modern period, left behind a large collection of manuscripts and letters at his death, and also a large number of books from his private library. At its height, I think his library contained in excess of 3,000 volumes, and Locke typically would inscribe each volume with his signature on the front board. At his death in 1704, the library was divided into two halves. One half was kept by his relatives, who subsequently became the Earls of Lovelace, and the other half was given to a family friend, a young man whose own descendants unfortunately frittered the books away, destroyed them in some cases, and sold them off. And now roughly only 1,000 books from Locke's library survive, but they tend to be conserved in a very large number of different collections around the world because of this dispersion. And so one challenge remains for scholars of Locke's reading, which is to attempt to locate all of these books in the libraries and various repositories around the world, which might hold them but not actually be aware that the books they possess are from Locke's own library. And one project which I was undertaking was to try and locate these books by systematically looking at library catalogues and archival catalogues, and also auction catalogues, particularly from 19th century dealers. And Craig very generously devoted a lot of his own time to the same project. And so we were Googling, searching online catalogues for Locke's books, and then Craig, I think, rather ingeniously began searching for Locke's manuscripts, because the papers that he conserved at his death, also suffered a somewhat similar fate, although the vast majority were kept by the Earls of Lovelace and are now available in the University of Oxford in the Bodleian Library. A small number escaped the possession of Locke's relatives and were also sold in the 19th century and the 20th century, and are now conserved in places like the New York Public Library or Houghton Library in Harvard University. And so it made sense to also search for repositories around the world for manuscripts by Locke, which perhaps had been lost from view. And that's, I think, the immediate context for when Craig began to search for manuscripts and hit, I think, pay dirt quite quickly. So I'll give it back to you, Craig.
Yeah, so yeah, I started looking for books first because Felix was looking for books, and he found about 30 at this point, and I was very jealous, so I thought I'd give it a go and see what I could do, and I turned up maybe 10 or something. I'm not totally sure how many, but not quite as many, but I was still pretty pleased with myself. But then Felix, as he rightly suggests, I started on the manuscript side of things. Now, they're a bit harder to track down, manuscripts, because they're usually a bit better catalogued and all that kind of stuff. So instead of looking through library catalogues, I then switched to just, I mean, this is going to sound ridiculous, but just randomly Googling stuff. If you Google John Locke manuscript, or formerly owned by John Locke or anything along those lines, you get tens of thousands of results. And I would spend days, hours and hours and hours, basically just moving through all these pages and see if anything looked vaguely plausible and worth looking at. And for the most part, they were things that were already catalogued, but every once in a while you'd find something interesting. And one day I came across this particular page, which was a page on the Antiquarian Booksellers Association, which is where a man is talking about how he became interested in collecting mezzotint portraits of ladies of repute from the second half of the 18th century, which didn't sound very promising when you saw the sort of little bit displayed on Google, but you think, okay, I'm going to look at that page just because it says Locke manuscript. And as you look here, as I highlighted on this particular bit, it said John Locke's autograph manuscript of his essay Reasons for Tolerating Papists Equally with Others, circa 1689, advertised for £52 and 10 shillings. And this is a particular book catalogue from Maggs Brothers, which is very helpful to identify it. When I saw this, I thought it was probably nonsense, because Locke obviously didn't tolerate Papists, and why would there be a manuscript from 1689 when he'd written all this stuff about toleration earlier than that, in 1685 or 1667? So I generally thought it was probably just an enterprising book dealer who was trying to, fluff up something that he was trying to sell to people. We've seen that on many occasions. We must have come across 4 or 5 different book catalogues where they suggest that they are selling Locke's own copy of the Essay Concerning Human Understanding with his own personal annotations, and we've traced every one of them, and that's all nonsense. So I thought it was the same deal here, but Maggs Brothers book catalogues are easy to find. They have a large selection of them at the British Library, so I thought I would go along and take a look at the British Library and see what they had. And this is a sort of, these are the 2 photographs that I took when I went to the British Library and looked in that particular book catalogue. And if you looked at John Locke's autograph, his manuscript handwriting style, you'll see from the thing over on the right there that that is indeed John Locke's handwriting. So, and it does indeed say reasons for tolerating Papists equally with others. And indeed, there are a list of reasons for tolerating Papists equally with others. So I have to say that as soon as I saw this, I thought to myself, crikey, this is pretty exciting. And I was somewhat bemused to see this. I just couldn't really get my head around it. But then I also was like vexed that there was just one page when it said there were 4 pages, and there was some further text which they sort of paraphrased here, which doesn't seem to be reasons for tolerating Papists over on the left-hand side. So it became then the sort of, it was quite frustrating because we'd sort of discovered something but hadn't quite nailed the whole thing. Then the question was, where is this manuscript? We know where it was in 1928. It was at Maggs Brothers in London, but it went somewhere and we needed to find it. And believe it or not, and this is going to sound kind of ridiculous, finding it was relatively straightforward. Once I knew that there was a manuscript called Reasons for Tolerating Papists Equally with Others, I thought to myself, why don't I just Google that particular phrase? That would be the simplest way to find it. I think it's not going to work because it seems too much like a bit of a joke, but I did indeed Google it, and 2 things came up. The first one was this page, which I'd already seen. Okay, jolly good. And the second one was this, which was the catalogue entry for St. John's College Library in Annapolis. So they had they digitized their catalogue, and this was basically it. This matched the description. They didn't have a date for it, but basically it was a few pages of this thing. It had exactly the same title and a tiny bit of detail about it. And this was enough for me to think, okay, I need to write to these people and find out exactly what it is they've got here, because it looks like they have something really quite interesting. So I wrote to them, and after a little while of back and forth for various logistical reasons, they sent me through the scans of this manuscript, which I'll sort of quickly sort of show you now. So this was this was the front page, which you've already seen, and as you can sort of see, it does look like Locke is presenting reasons for tolerating Papists. The list on the side of page suggests that it's referring to some other text. And the question is, what text is that exactly? Is it one of Locke's own texts? Is it a reference to some other text? Not totally sure. But I'd already seen this bit, and I was like, this is quite surprising. But then you get to the rest of the content, and it's another list of stuff. But these are all arguments against the toleration of Papists. And there's a lot more of them, as you can sort of see here. And if you look on the back page of the manuscript, it's dated. Its toleration is the endorsement, and the date 67. So I have no idea why the Maggs Brothers said this was dated 1689 when it obviously says 1667 on there. And we know that also sort of handled other Locke manuscripts which were also from that same period. Maybe again they were just trying to plump up the price to make it look like it was something to do with Locke's published letter. But this was kind of it. Then the question was, what does all this mean? So at this particular point, I had these scans. I sort of created a textual version of this, and I sort of shared it with Felix and 2 other gentlemen, a chap called John Milton and Mark Goldie, who both sit on the board of the Clarendon edition of Locke's works as general editor and chairman, and say, hey, I think I found something kind of interesting. So we then spent some time trying to figure out what all this meant. And the key question was kind of who's he referring to? What are these numbers here? Are they referring to a work of his own, which is my initial thought / hope, because then it'd be really fun if these were arguments he was putting into one of his own works, or does it refer to some other publication somewhere else? So we then started to look at the pamphlet debate, and Mark and John suggested that we share the manuscript scan with one of their colleagues on the board, a lady called Jacqueline Rose at the University of St. Andrews, who had actually been working on this question relatively recently. There were 23 different things published in this pamphlet debate, and it looked like it was going to be quite a slog to try and look through each one of these things and identify which one of these Locke might have been talking about, if indeed he was talking about any of them. But sharing it with Jacqueline short-circuited all that particular thing, as she'd worked on all this stuff relatively recently, and she quickly identified I think fourth from the bottom in the right-hand column. So Charles Wolseley's Liberty of Conscience, the Magistrate's Interest, as the work that Locke was referring to. I've talked quite a bit now, Felix, so perhaps you would want to maybe walk them through what Wolseley was up to in this particular book.
Sure. So, as Craig has been saying, the date of the manuscript, the reasons for tolerating papers equally with others, is 1667, and this coincided with the disaster, the naval disaster at Medway in Kent, the fall of the Duke of Clarendon, and the possibility that Charles II would be issuing a declaration of indulgence or an act of toleration for people who dissented from the Church of England, Protestant nonconformists, those who refused to worship within the walls of the Church of England or to follow its liturgy. These people had been persecuted actively since 1660, 1662. They were forbidden from staging their own religious conventicles or meetings. And this persecution, as all of you will know, underlies the initial waves of immigration that took place to the colonies of North America by disconcerted Protestants, and also in some cases Catholics. So 1667 to 1668, nonconformist Protestants begin to publish pamphlets like those Craig just showed you, arguing in favor of their toleration, in favor of their ability to worship outside of the Church of England without any legal debilities or punishments. And one author who writes in favor of the liberty of conscience is Charles Wolseley, and he does so in two pamphlets, but the most significant for our purposes is this one, Liberty of Conscience, the Magistrate's Interest, which made an argument in favor of the liberty of conscience, which was somewhat unusual, namely that in addition to there being an argument that an individual's conscience is inviolable, that they ought to be given as much freedom as they wish to worship and to believe speculative matters without any type of legal consequences or intercession by the magistrate. He also said that it would be reasonable and profitable if the state were to tolerate any religious sect, because toleration redounds to the benefit or the interest of the state. It will bring in taxation revenue. It will allow talented office holders from serving in Parliament or in other offices from which they had previously been disqualified because of their refusal to worship within the Church of England or swear any oath to the 39 or observe the 39 Articles. And in that respect, it's an argument that might be described as rather etatist or politique, so expressing a strain of thought which had emerged particularly in the 16th century in France, which argued that the truthfulness of any particular religious doctrines are extraneous when it comes to matters of state. The reason of state, the strength of the state is the principal concern of the magistrate, and that in that respect you should tolerate any religious sect without worrying about its veracity or its adherence to or accordance with fundamental religious truth. Wolseley disqualifies only one group from toleration in his pamphlet, and that is Catholics. And Catholics cannot be extended toleration at all because they admix their own speculative religious beliefs in transubstantiation, for example, with her seditious doctrines about the supremacy of the Pope, the Pope's ability to dissolve the oaths of Catholics, and to depose foreign rulers as excommunicates or heretics. And for that reason, Walmsley is regarded as someone who favors liberty of conscience for everyone except Catholics. And that is why it's rather surprising to find Locke using the manuscript which Craig discovered to seek reasons for tolerating Catholics equally with others on the basis of arguments which he finds in Walmsley's tract. So I hope that helps for the moment.
Yeah, absolutely brilliant. Thank you. So yeah, it was kind of surprising to see arguments at all from Locke's pen arguing for the toleration of Papists. And once we sort of found the place where, well, Jacqueline had found and kindly shared the place where Locke was sort of taking these arguments from, we could then sort of do a job of looking to see, okay, what was Locke doing here? There's no particular place where Locke uses the Liberty of Conscience book to use one part of it, to use it to kind of create arguments both pro and con, but there's one particular page where he actually does that, so where two arguments kind of somewhat adjacent. Locke uses one of them to argue pro toleration and one to argue against. So that's page 7. So if you sort of look here, that sort of thing where he says this has 3 ill effects always attending to it. First, it disobliges the best sort of men in every party whom the state should most cherish and engage. And in the first part of the first set of responses to this thing, Locke takes that argument and sort of turns it on its head, and well, not turns it on its head, extends it even further than Walmsley would ever have sort of suggested, and said, right, persecution disobliges the best sort among the Papists, as well as amongst others. So that's an argument for extending toleration to the Papists, and he does that in several different places, primarily from the beginning of Walmsley's work. But then when he goes back and creates his list, his reasons against this, the next paragraph, second, Walmsley says, all standers by, the generality of a nation looking on must needs be dissatisfied to see a plain, honest man, upright and punctual in all his dealings amongst men, punished merely for his conscience to God. Locke takes that argument and said, standers by will be less dissatisfied with severity used to the Papist than to others because it is lex talionis. I can't remember what's the meaning of that particular phrase now? Like
an eye for an eye.
An eye for an eye, exactly. Besides, he can't be thought to be punished merely for conscience, who owns himself at the same time the subject and adherent of an enemy prince. So Locke's kind of using Walmsley's liberty of conscience to sort of construct these arguments pro and con, and kind of kicking the tires, perhaps, of how far these arguments can be extended. And in some cases, using arguments directly adjacent to each other to to carry that out. So there's been this previous, so A, it's kind of surprising to see that Locke is making any arguments pro the toleration of Catholics at all. So that is quite a startling thing to see. B, this was quite interesting to see that it was embedding Locke's work directly into the debates of the time. The essay concerning toleration, we knew he'd written it around this time, but we had no idea whether he was writing it in response to any of the work that was going on at this time, or if he'd read any of these pamphlets. And now we know for certain that he had actually read at least one of these pamphlets and directly responded to it. But then that did lead on to the next question of, how did the reasons relate to the essay concerning toleration? Now, remember, the essay is the place where Locke sort of first formulated his arguments for toleration. And there's, he's kind of, this thing is written around the same time. So the kind of key question is, what exactly was going on? What's the relationship between the reasons and the essay? And at this particular point in time, it's worth just drawing out the fact that the essay was actually comprised of, at this particular point in 1667, there were 2 different versions of it. There was a single sheet thing, which we're going to call the first draft, and then Locke went on to write a much more extended treatment of this question, which we'll call the essay proper. So then the question of the reasons becomes, okay, what's the relationship between the reasons, the first draft, and the essay proper? And we spent a bit of time trying to figure out exactly what the relationship between those things were. So the first thing to kind of find out was, where did these things all come from? And Felix did some amazing detective work looking through auction catalogues right back in, I think this was 1920, 28, 22, was it right? 22,
I think, yeah.
Yeah, so he found that this particular auction catalogue at Sotheby's was a lot of property from a chap called E.C.S. Stanford. Was it E.C.B. or E.C.E.? Anyway, E.C. Stanford, who was one of the descendants of Locke's friend, Edward Clarke. And in this particular sale catalogue, you can see there's a number of different items. It's actually quite fuzzy. But I think it's number 866, number 867, and number 868 were all items related to toleration. 866 and 867 made up the first draft and the essay proper, and 868 were the reasons for tolerating Papists. So they'd all come from the same place. They'd all once been the property of Edward Clarke, and they all kind of derived from that particular source, which was kind of an interesting finding in and of itself, that these things were kind of somewhat proximate in their ownership. We then started looking at the physical construction of the manuscript. So we looked at the paper source from which it was made. So this is the watermarks in the reasons itself. There's a horn in this kind of motif design in folios 3 and 4, and the countermark is a PC over here. And we then compared that with some of the watermarks from the essay concerning toleration. So I flew out to Los Angeles because that's where the essay concerning toleration first draft and essay proper are at the moment, and took these photographs by looking at them. So the first draft of the essay, which was this long single sheet, very hard to see, but over on the left-hand side it has the same sort of horn in that elaborate device. And then the essay proper, Quire D, has the same device and a PC countermark, which suggests that they were all written at roughly the same time and drawn from the same paper source. So it wasn't like Locke was doing the reasons at one point significantly early or later on. It looks like it was all written in a very sort of close sort of proximity period of time, which was kind of interesting as well. And then we got into actually looking into the detail of the text. So if you look at the, this is two different sides of the page, comparing bits of text from the reasons for tolerating Papists with the essay concerning toleration. And you can see that they actually match up in certain places. So there's certain bits of the text of the reasons reappear in the essay concerning toleration, or vice versa. There's a question as to which came first. We spent a bit of time looking at the details of this, but basically it's almost certain that, well, I'd say it is certain that the reasons for tolerating Papists were written first. If you look at the word, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but if you look at the word rather on the far left-hand side, that's sort of bold over there, that was, and then look at the essay concerning toleration version of it, it was actually copied into the essay concerning toleration first, and then Locke struck it out. It's almost impossible to believe that Locke copied it out in the essay concerning toleration first, then went back to the reasons and copied it out there. It's much more straightforward to believe that he wrote it in the reasons first and then copied it into the essay and then struck it out. There are later copies of the essay concerning toleration as well, where the word rather was never written in there in the first place, which makes it almost certain, I'd say certain, that the reasons was written earlier than the essay concerning toleration proper. So we know that the reasons preceded the essay proper. The question then is, does it precede the first draft? Which is kind of a really interesting question. So this is the opening of the first draft of the essay concerning toleration, and it sort of says, to state the question of toleration right, one, I suppose that there are only two sorts of things that have a right to toleration. The first is all purely speculative opinions, as the belief of the Trinity, fall, antipodes, atoms, etc., which we have no reference, which have no reference at all to society, and oh god, would be the same were the I can't read that last bit, it's all deleted. And the second one, which is the place, time, and manner of worshipping my God. To both these, Papists and all mankind seem to have a title. And then Locke underlined that phrase about Papists and all mankind. And then he continues on to talk about toleration in general and what people should be allowed to believe and shouldn't be allowed to believe. But it's just interesting that when he was writing this, Papists were at the sort of the top of mind for him. And then looking at the end of the first draft of the essay, on the reverse side of this same single sheet, he sort of writes 4 conclusions. He said, first, that Papists and all the men have a right to toleration and their religious worship and speculative opinions. The second one's about Papists. The third one's about Papists. The fourth one's about Papists. And that was kind of originally the end. So as it was, because if you look at the line underneath, and it says, and this perhaps may be, and these perhaps may be rules for other parties as well as Papists, and then struck that out, and then added an extra thing where he talks about dissenters in general. So that last point, the point number 5, was actually an addition, which was written significantly later than those first 4 conclusions. And when the first draft was first written, Locke was talking about Papists at the beginning, and all of his conclusions were about Papists at the end. And here he kind of concluded that they shouldn't be allowed toleration. So if we're asking ourselves the question of where does the reasons fit in respect of the first draft of the essay, our strong feeling is that it probably, very likely preceded the first draft of the essay, because Locke wrote the reasons first, some reasons pro, some reasons con, and then looked to kind of create a much more systematic treatment of whether or not Catholics should be tolerated. And then it looks like he expanded his thought to consider whether or not dissenters in general should be tolerated, which is this final point here where he sort of expands the scope of this discussion. And then he stops and thinks to himself, actually, there's a bigger essay to be written here about toleration altogether, and then moved in to write the essay proper. It seems very unlikely to us that he wrote the first draft of the essay proper, which concluded that Papists should not be tolerated, and then went back to look for reasons concerning reasons for tolerating Papists and wrote a bunch of arguments for him. It seems very unlikely to us that that was the case. It seems much more likely that he wrote the reasons first, pro and con, then he wrote a more systematic treatment about toleration, looking primarily at Catholics, and then he wrote a much more general essay concerning toleration altogether, which would lead us to this statement, that it's certain that the reasons precedes the essay proper, because we know that the text of the reasons was repeated in the essay proper, and we think it's almost certain that the reasons preceded the first draft of the essay, because the topic would suggest that that was the case, and then that led to the essay itself. Now, why did Locke do any of this? We sort of alluded to the discussion around the question of an indulgence or a tolerance at the time. And Felix, did you want to expatiate a little bit on what might have been driving Locke's questioning, or whether it actually played a role, perhaps?
Sure. Pardon me. I think something which is probably occurring to all of you is why would Locke be seeking reasons for tolerating Papists or Catholics, not only in 1667 to 8, but really at any phase of his life, when, as many of you I'm sure know, the one group, or rather the two groups whom he would famously exclude from religious toleration are atheists, because they're incapable of keeping their promises or oaths, and Catholics. And what makes the manuscript which Craig discovered so unusual is that for the first and only time among any of Locke's extant manuscripts, he is making an argument in favor of the toleration of Catholics, even though he is so adamant in practically every statement about the matter that Catholics are intolerable because of their seditious or political views. So their speculative opinions on transubstantiation or the Trinity are perfectly eligible for toleration because they have no civil ramifications. But the issue has always been, as Locke says, that Catholics are incapable of separating these speculative positions from civil doctrines or political theology, doctrines which commit them to the belief that the Pope is the universal sovereign, and that their own domestic or local sovereigns are subservient to the universal sovereignty of the Pope. What the reasons for tolerating Papists equally with others appears to say is that the political theology of Catholics is actually irrelevant to the question of whether they should be tolerated. People of ability deserve toleration because of the benefits they'll bring to the state at large. That's an extraordinarily unusual position, not only for Locke to adopt, but for any Protestant theorist of toleration to adopt in 17th century England. And so naturally the question is, well, why is Locke putting forward this argument? And in our article, academic article about the manuscript, we, I think, canvass a few different possibilities about what Locke is actually doing in this manuscript and what might have prompted him in 1667 to 1668 to write in favor of the toleration of Catholics. One possibility is that he's not actually in favor of the toleration of Catholics at all. One half of the manuscript gives a number of reasons why we should tolerate Catholics, but the other half of the manuscript gives a number of reasons why we shouldn't. And it could be the case that Locke is, as it were, arguing both sides of the case, both sides of the argument, in order to clarify his own thinking. And I think more importantly, to really determine adequately why it is that Catholics cannot benefit from the liberty of conscience which he's defending for Protestants. What is it that makes Catholics special in this case, which excludes them from toleration? So that's one possibility, is that he's not actually in favor of the toleration of Catholics, but is simply being quite dutiful or diligent in exploring both sides of the argument. And this is a fairly common approach in a lot of early modern philosophical disputation. And Locke would be very familiar with this mode of discussion. The second possibility we canvass is that Ashley, Locke's patron, anticipated that Charles II, whose own wife and mother-in-law were Catholic, mother, I should say, a Catholic, and who was surrounded by Catholics, whose brother would soon convert to Catholicism. There might have been a belief that Charles II was about to issue an act of indulgence for Catholics as well as Protestants, and that Ashley, as a preeminent politician, would be charged with formulating a theory or a defense of this political act, and that Locke was, as it were, commissioned by Ashley to produce a theory of toleration which could be extended to Catholics. So that's another possibility. I think ultimately we can't really say for certain what it is he's doing in the manuscript, beyond simply putting forward these possibilities. But it would appear that if the essay concerning toleration is any guide to what Locke's actual positions are in 1667 to 8, that what Locke is attempting to do, I think, is, as it were, immunize his theory of toleration from the claim that it could be expropriated or, as it were, arrogated by Catholics and used in their own defense. And he's attempting to draw up reasons why Catholics are actually ineligible for toleration. That's probably a summary overview of where we got to in discussing this manuscript and its purposes.
Indeed. And there is some evidence that Locke was, as we've mentioned earlier, was considering this question independently prior to working with Ashley. And these are some notes that he made about books to read earlier in 1667, prior to his move to London. And if you look at the bottom of the left-hand column, he lists out Campanella, Conson, and Hyron, works by those folks, and says, on these last three authors, you have the way and methods described of the Papists carrying on their design in England. So clearly the question of what Catholics were up to and whether or not they should be tolerated was one that was kind of pressing for him at this point in his career. So it may have just been, he might have written this off his own back as much as at the request of Ashley. It's very hard to say. But I think Felix is right to emphasize that Catholics did pose a very particular problem for sort of advocates of toleration at this time. If you are going to advocate a general toleration, you are going to need to provide some outline of where that stops and why exactly it might be that Catholics are intolerable. And it was Locke's identification of their admixture of spiritual and temporal matters together in their doctrines that made them particularly problematic. It's because they say that the Pope is infallible, and because the Pope can dissolve oaths, and because the Pope can choose to depose kings or assert that kings can be deposed, that they have this particularly problematic element. And Locke might have been seen to be working through some of those issues as he was developing, moving from the reasons to the first draft to the essay itself, because as he does that, he becomes less and less charitable in his sort of particular statements. So that's kind of our sort of thoughts around that. But some quick conclusions, because we've been going on a lot longer than I thought we would, about this. If we accept the hypothesis that the reasons precedes the first draft of the essay, which we think is very, very likely, then the reasons would present Locke's first systematic arguments for toleration. That first list of reasons for tolerating Papists are his sort of first systematic statement of why anyone should be tolerated. He obviously discussed toleration previously, but he didn't present arguments for it. Here is the case where he's actually presenting arguments. The reasons is startlingly tolerant in its outlook, and we don't see that anywhere else in Locke's work, as we've discussed. And it appears that the reasons was the immediate antecedent and inspiration for the essay concerning toleration. So he started with this question of Catholic toleration. That was really what he was working on. That then prompted him to think about toleration in general, and prompted him to create these arguments for toleration in the essay concerning toleration, which, when they were repeated in the letter concerning toleration in 1689, would be immensely influential. So that's why we think the reasons is particularly interesting, because it's kind of like it's the sort of catalyst or the kernel of some of these ideas right at its very earliest stage, and from the reasons you can trace a lineage in his thought through to the letter concerning toleration, which in itself was hugely influential in the wider world. So I think that's kind of our talk today. I hope that's sort of somewhat helpful.
Okay, thanks. I'd love to open it up to questions if you have a little bit more time. I know night has fallen where you are. But maybe if you were.
No, it's fine. I can take questions are fine.
Yes.
As long as I can hear them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you for your excellent paper. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, that's great.
Good. It's wonderful detective work, and it's wonderful to see great scholars at work reconstructing manuscript. I wonder about some of the inspiration for Locke's reasons, and whether he was drawing on some of the rather adventuresome speculations about religious freedom and liberty of conscience in the interregnum period. Some of the levelers, in particular, Lilburn and Wallen, based in part on Article 1 of Chapter 1 of Magna Carta, were pressing some pretty adventuresome arguments. Milton in the 1640s and 50s was, and there was also a pretty ample Dutch pamphlet literature that was being translated and sent over to England in the 1640s and 50s. And in that collection of material, there's a good bit of inclusiveness in the understanding of toleration, to include Protestant sects of various types, to include Jews, and to include Catholics and also Orthodox Christians. And I'm wondering if Locke had access to any of that material, if it was indicated when he was at Oxford or perhaps thereafter, and whether he's drawing on some of that material as part of the initial speculations about whether it's appropriate in the Restoration to think hard again about a wider providence of toleration than the Restoration Acts of Uniformity at all would offer.
That's definitely one for you, Felix.
Okay. No, well, that's a fantastic question. I think one of the one of the most interesting features of this manuscript is that it's placing Locke in dialogue with another theorist of toleration. Locke, rather like, and frustratingly like Thomas Hobbes, for example, is extraordinarily tight-lipped about his intellectual debts. And when you read the letter concerning toleration, for example, or any of the other subsequent letters in response to the pamphlet debate which that provoked, he's rather unwilling ever to identify intellectual sources or sympathizers or predecessors in mounting this position, or in placing himself in dialogue with other authors. So what makes the reasons for tolerating papers equally with others so unusual is that it's evidence that Locke is reading quite carefully another living theorist of toleration from the 1660s. And it's, I think, establishing unquestionably that he was a reader of this type of literature, and that literature was actually informing his own writing. However, there's no question whatsoever that he would have been familiar, I think, with precisely the literature you're describing. He has left us a very large number of handwritten notes of his reading, in addition to books that were once in his library. There's no shortage of literature about toleration there. Levelers feature, I think, in one or two items, although he's not in anywhere inclined to acknowledge his debt to the Levelers in any of his political writings. When he traveled to the Netherlands, when he traveled to Cleves, it's quite certain he would have been exposed to some of the literature you're describing. Some of the notes which I think appear on the perhaps anti-penultimate slide that Craig showed you, Politici, his reading from 1667 shows that he was thinking about whether Catholics could be tolerated on the basis of contemporary writings on the issue. So I think in addition to these ideas being, as you said, in the atmosphere, what you have is also an author who is a somewhat omnivorous reader, who's willing, I think, to confide his, I think, intellectual interest to private manuscripts, but somewhat reluctant to confess his debts publicly. And I think the Reasons is an interesting example of where his private reading is then, I think, spilling over into a manuscript which he probably did intend for publication, the essay concerning toleration, which, pardon me, which I think, and Craig can correct me, doesn't cite any other living author at all. And so part of the difficulty which the editors of the essay concerning toleration faced when they produced their critical edition in 2006 was that the manuscripts of the essay do not cite anyone at all. And so it becomes quite, becomes quite difficult to understand where Locke's getting his ideas from, beyond the, I think, fairly modest supposition that he was probably reading relevant writings in that time.
Thank you.
Yeah, just to add a little bit to that. So he definitely was reading people like Stubb, and there were other people, I think, was it Bagshaw earlier, that he was reading in his time at Oxford. I'm not aware of him having read Dutch literature or pamphlet literature at that point. I've done quite a bit of digging around his early reading because prior to moving to London, Locke was actually training to be a doctor. So just, he's definitely an omnivorous reader, and he read quite widely. But perhaps at that point, his own real depth was in medical writing. So he read oodles and oodles and oodles of medical textbooks while he was at Oxford in the time up until he came to London in 1667. So I'd be surprised if he read. He may have been aware of that stuff, but I'd be surprised if he read it in depth. I think it was more just the people he may have known at Oxford that he would have consulted. But that's just a hunch based on my understanding of his medical writings.
A question about the transition between the reasons document and then the final draft of the essay. Was that method that you sort of map out here, where it's sort of on the one hand, on the other hand, and then leading to this final sort of synthetic argument, is that common that you know of within Locke's other writings? Was that sort of a typical process for him to go through these multiple drafts of considering both sides of an argument and then synthesizing his own?
So I don't think, so it was very common for him to go through multiple drafts of iterations on his work. But as far as I'm aware, I can't think of any other instance where there's something even vaguely comparable to this. He definitely responded to other authors. So he wrote, a very long extended treatment in response to Edward Stillingfleet's unreasonableness of separation. But I can't think of another example where he has this pro and con or arguments for and against thing anywhere else. Can you think of anything, Felix?
No, nothing that jumps to mind at all. Nothing of significance, at least. Certainly not, no.
So it's somewhat unique, unique in its content. It's unique in its sort of position in Locke's work, because it sort of sits at the very genesis of this discussion. And it's unique somewhat in format, because I don't think we've ever sort of seen anything where he's done something sort of pro or con, pro and con. Usually he'd just write, he'd write an opinion. In the 2 Tracts of Government, he just wrote a bunch of essays. He would make assertions. He might change his mind later on, but I can't think of any other instance where it's pro one side and then pro the other. So it's kind of strange. The whole thing was kind of strange.
Well, I have a question. Were you able to trace, I guess, the reason's journey into St. John's College? I noticed on the screen the catalog for St. John's College, it said it was, I guess, in a home of a particular person. And then later on, you mentioned that was in an auction house in the 1920s. Were you able to find how it landed from went from John Locke's work into St. John's College?
So more or less, yeah. So as we sort of mentioned when we showed you the Sotheby's catalogue, that was a set of material from a descendant of Locke's friend Edward Clarke. So clearly Clarke got this material directly from Locke himself at some point. We speculate that the most likely point that would have happened was in 1683 when Locke went into hiding. There's correspondence where Locke says, "I've sent you a bunch of papers. You do with them what you think is best. And if you need to burn some of them, go ahead," more or less, paraphrasing somewhat. And we suspect that this material about toleration was some of those papers. And there's also suspicion amongst other scholars that at least one part of, or several parts of, 2 treaties of government in manuscript were given to Clarke at that point, and Clarke did indeed destroy them. Those particular parts, anyway. So that Clarke had them at a certain point. They were sold in Sotheby's in 1922. They went to Maggs Brothers, which is a book dealer. They were advertised on a number of occasions, I think 3 occasions, and they were sold in about 28 to a novelist in America. I can't remember his name. What was his name? Anderson, yeah. Such and such. He then
Paul Hyde Bonner.
Paul Anderson. Paul Hyde Bonner. Yeah, sorry, Paul Hyde Bonner. They were then sold again in the 1930s at some sort of auction, and we don't know exactly when they were given to St. John's College, but this chap Henry MacDonald is the chap identified, and some very assiduous fellow sent us an email a month or 2 ago suggesting that this Henry MacDonald fellow was a lawyer in New York who was particularly interested in Catholicism and matters of sort of Catholic interest, and that he may have donated this to St. John's College because it's in Maryland, and Maryland was one of the first, I think, American colonies set up specifically to provide refuge for Catholics. Is that right, Felix?
I think that's a speculation about why he donated it to St. John's. Yeah.
I have another question, if I could. Your article and your discovery have been amazingly widely covered, not just in sort of academic presses, but in all sorts of different news and media outlets. What do you see as the reason for the intense interest in your discovery, other than that it's just really interesting for Locke scholars and for people who study things like religious liberty?
I think, oh, sorry, if I might afford a speculation, I think it's probably a couple of reasons. One is, you know, because of where we think it sits at the beginning of Locke's arguments about toleration, then it's kind of just generally interesting. If you're interested in religious toleration and Western civilization in general, then and some of the constituent elements of that, then if you can find something that's kind of a catalyst or a sort of the seed that kind of grew some large part of that, that's quite interesting in and of itself. But I think also the questions of religious tolerance in general have become more salient recently than they might otherwise have been. So when you're sort of looking at people talking about banning certain religious groups from entering certain countries, the questions of religious toleration become much more pressing than they have in the relatively recent past. I think it's intrinsically quite interesting if you're if you are a member of Western civilization to understand the history of it, but also when that particular part of the sort of fabric of your polity starts to become a bit unraveled, you might become a bit more interested in it. So that's my 2 cent speculation as to why it's been so widely covered.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's very similar judgment.
Can I ask if there are any Catholic responses in this period between the reasons and the final essay that would help trigger the increasingly anti-Catholic or anti-Papist backlash? And I ask that in the context of the American 19th century, where there's initial enthusiasm about toleration and free exercise for all groups, including Catholics. And then in the course of the 19th century, after Majority Voss in 1832, all the way through to the Syllabus of Errors in 1864, an increasingly strident anti-Catholicism that manifests itself both informally but then increasingly formally as well. And it was in some sense a reaction to what were considered at the time to be anti-liberal sentiments on the part of both the papacy and the local Episcopal leadership. And the question is whether there's something comparable going on in England at the same time that might explain why Locke initially is more open to toleration of Catholics than he chooses to be in the end in his essay. Are there papal statements? Are there local Catholic invectives? Are there statements from the continent in bishops or academic prose that might have triggered things?
Would you like, is Craig still there?
No, I'm still there. I was going to afford an opinion, but if you want to, Felix, go ahead.
Pardon me. I think the short answer is that Catholics in England in this particular era are terrified to openly profess their faith, much less to defend it in print under their own names. And nominally Catholic contributions to the pamphlet debate, which we've described, and the contributions to which Craig listed on that slide are non-existent, in part because of an hysterical fear of Catholics, which Locke himself shares when in 1667 he writes that Papists have designs on reconverting England. And it's a fear that's persisted since the Armada in 1588. You'll know when Thomas Hobbes writes his own autobiography, he says that fear and I were born twins. This is in 1588, and he dies in 1679, about the time he writes this autobiography. And that's around 12 years after the essay concerning toleration is completed. But that also coincides with one of the most extraordinary episodes in British political life in the 17th century, you know, really up there with the civil wars, which is the Popish plot, the idea that Catholics, particularly Jesuit conspirators, were coordinating to assassinate Charles II. This was issued in a number of show trials, executions of totally innocent Catholics or people who were accused of being Catholic sympathizers, and coincided also with the extraordinary attempts to use the powers of the Parliament to exclude James, Duke of York, from accession to the throne. So I think any Catholic who ventured to defend the Catholic interest in England in this time would be, I think, not only metaphorically, but rather literally placing their head on the chopping block and placing, you know, themselves in the sights of not only polite opinion, which was virulently anti-Catholic, but also the machinery of the state. And I think if one of the most extraordinary, I suppose, contradictions in British history at this time is that the vast majority of the British people, insofar as their opinions can be measured at this time, are anti-Catholic. Yet the king, his wife, his brother, his mother, and the closest members of the court are Catholics, and genuinely do seem to want to convert to Catholicism. At one point, seeking the help of Louis XIV to possibly fund a type of campaign of reconversion. But a lot of these are fantasies that, you know, can only be, I think, sustained by the fervid and isolated minds of people who are surrounded by yes men and Catholic sympathizers anyway. There was never any chance that Britain would be reconverted without a forcible invasion. And I think that's what makes this document so unusual, or makes it so hard to believe that Locke genuinely thought that a toleration for Catholics would actually be issued by Charles II, because there's so much dissent, so much criticism of that, even prospectively, that it's hard to imagine it could have been issued. The only one thing I'll add is that by the 70s, a small group of Catholics in England begin to say that they will formulate an oath of allegiance for English Catholics, specially written for them, in which English Catholics will, as it were, hive themselves off from Roman Catholicism, and they'll renounce any belief in the Pope's temporal supremacy and the Pope's infallibility, and state straightforwardly, categorically, that their allegiance lies only with the King of England. This oath of allegiance for English Catholics goes nowhere, but rather interestingly, Locke does have a copy of one of these oaths of allegiance, a draft of it, in the handwriting of one of these Catholic propagandists. So it was clear that Locke, took some sort of interest in this possibility, but whether he was ever prepared to truly defend Catholics who had not renounced the supremacy of the Pope is a totally separate question. So I apologize if that's a rather long-winded response, but
I just want to add one additional practical point about the relationship between the reasons, the first draft, and the essay itself. There's no way to sort of definitively prove it, but my guess is that they were written in relatively quick succession, that Locke wrote the reasons and then quickly moved on to the first draft and then quickly moved on to the essay proper. I don't think this was a long, drawn-out kind of, he wrote this over several months. My guess is he wrote it, potentially in a few weeks or maybe even a few days. He was just engaging with these questions and burnt through a bunch of drafts to kind of get to a point where he was satisfied with a particular answer to this question. So the probability is that the time was so relatively short that there wasn't going to be the opportunity for anything external to kind of sway his views. And if you actually read the three documents in that order, you can kind of see a very quick evolution of how he thinks about Catholics and how his views on toleration are sort of quickly evolving to land on the positions that he would then stick to more or less for the rest of his life. Hope that's helpful.
Well, Drs. Walmsley and Waldmann, we just want to thank you for your time today. We're actually really humbled that you joined us today for our colloquy. Not only because night has fallen and Dr. Waldmann seems to be filling in.
Sorry, this.
I'll make sure that we
Yeah.
hear you. But also because you decided to give us a private audience to discuss your work. As Justin mentioned, you're in the popular press here in America, and we're very excited about this work, and you condescended to be with us for a few hours today, so thank you so much for that.